barking also at 10:15 to 10:20. Now, and just to remind you, Pablo Fenbez's house is the yellow one indicated here on the board, so just across the alley behind Ms. Brown's condo. All right, now, Louis Karp also told you something else. He told you that when he came home, he went into his garage, and then he went out in front to get the mail. And when he went out in front to get the mail, he saw a dog in the street. And this was the time he indicated that he got home. When he got outside, he saw a dog running around in the street, barking insistently. A dog that he identified for you as Cato, Nicole's dog. The dog was prancing around in the street and acting in a very weird manner, and Mr. Karp was a little afraid of him and went back inside. Now, Mr. Karp also told you that he saw a man walking a dog. Steve Schwab told you that at about 10:30 he left his home and went out and took his dog for a walk. If you recall, he said that he waited to see the end of the Dick Van Dyke Show and then went out to walk his dog. It was about a little after 10:30. He told you of the route that he took, walking around the neighborhood, and he told you that at approximately 10:55 he saw Cato, Nicole's dog, at the corner of Dorothy and Bundy. And he told you that the dog was acting very strangely. So he went over to look at the dog. And when he did, he noticed that the dog had blood on its back paw, and the blood appeared to be moist. He crossed over to the east side of Bundy where he said the lighting was better. In other words, saying to you that the side of the street that Nicole lived on was poorly lit. Now, he noticed that the dog's paws had blood on it, but he did not testify that he saw any paw prints on the sidewalk. Does that mean that they weren't there? No. It means he didn't notice them. Obviously, if the dog had blood on its paw, and it had gone out of Nicole's home, and it had walked down the sidewalk, there were paw prints there to be seen. The fact that someone doesn't see something doesn't mean it isn't there. It means they didn't see it. That's what I mean about reasonable inferences to be drawn from the evidence. Now, when he crossed over to the east side of Bundy where they had more light, the dog stayed with Steve. He stayed and they continued to walk. But as they walked, at each house that there was a pathway, the dog stopped and barked, looking up the pathway. This dog was acting very strangely. Obviously, it had seen a very traumatic event. Whether it actually witnessed the murders or simply came up on the bloody aftermath, it's clear the dog saw something. Now, when Steve got home, he took the dog into his courtyard, and he was able to see that there was blood on the underside of the belly, and there was blood on all four paws. But the dog was not injured. Now, Steve's friend, Sukru Bostepi, if you recall, he was the one who found the bodies. Sukru agreed to take the dog from Steve for the night. And when you recall that when he took him into his apartment, the dog was acting so agitated and so nervous that he had to take it out for a walk, and he decided to let it lead him, perhaps lead him to where it lived. And the dog did lead him. The dog pulled. The dog pulled, and as they went south on Bundy, the dog pulled harder and harder. And as they walked south on Bundy towards Nicole's home, when it got to the pathway that led up to Nicole's house, the dog stopped. And it looked up the pathway. And Sukru told you that had the dog not done that, he would not have looked up the pathway. And he would not have seen what he saw. But as it was, he did. And because he followed that dog's gaze, he saw a sight, probably the most horrifying one ever seen in his life, or hopefully ever will see. Now, Sukru told you that when he saw Nicole Brown lying on the ground, it was midnight. So we know that the murders occurred after 10 and before midnight. That's the window that we know we have just based on what people observed and what people saw. Now I'd like to turn to the defendant's activities for that night. And I'm going to show you how during the time period preceding the barking during the barking, and for over half an hour after the barking, the defendant's whereabouts are unaccounted for. Let's start with Cato. Cato was a necessary witness for us to call, but he was by no means a witness who was happy to testify for the prosecution, as you could tell. This was the defendant's house guest. Someone who started out as Nicole's friend and boarder, who found a better deal, certainly a cheaper deal, at the defendant's estate. You'll recall that he met Nicole after her divorce back in 1992 in Aspen. And when he went to a party at her house on Gretna Green in during 1993 or the end of 1992, he asked if he could rent the guest house on that property, and she agreed. And they made an arrangement that he would pay monthly rent and reduce that monthly rent to some extent by performing babysitting activities for her 2 children. Now, he lived there with her in Gretna Green for almost a year, filling in as babysitter for the children, a friend to her, and the children as well. But when Nicole moved in January of 1994 to Bundy, there was no separate home for him to live in, no separate guest house. Now, what's probably even more significant than Cato's lack of observation of any cuts on the defendant's hand when they're at the drive-through lane is this. Cato wound up paying for the food with his own money, paid for both of them. He handed the defendant the money, the defendant paid, the defendant got change back, and gave it to Cato. Gave it to Cato. Wasn't the whole point of talking to Cato to get change for the sky cap, get 5s for the sky cap? Okay, now you have another inconsistency here. First of all, he asked Cato to give him change when he's going out already, he can get it himself. Secondly, he has the opportunity to get change right there at the drive-through window, either take Cato's or break the 20 that Cato gave him, and he doesn't take that opportunity. That's important too. I'll come back to it. They returned to Rockingham, and Cato proceeded, wanted to indicate, when they returned during the ride home, the defendant wolfed his food down while he was driving. Cato saved his. And all of these facts are going to be tied in at the end of this presentation. So I ask for your patience. Bear with me. I want to stick with the timing right now so I don't get distracted. When they got back to Rockingham, Cato got out and he walked towards the house, expecting the defendant to follow him. But when he got to the front door, he turned and he realized he's not here. And he saw the defendant still standing by the Bentley, watching him. And he had not moved. So as Cato told you, he took the hint, turned and went to his room. Now, why didn't the defendant just walk in the house? Or, if he intended to go somewhere, why didn't he just get back in the car and go? Either in the Bentley or in the Bronco. Why wait for Cato to be out of sight? I'll come back to it. Let's think about it for a minute. Now, as soon as Cato got back to his room, he called a friend, and fortunately the friend lived far enough away that it was a long-distance call, so we have his phone bill that indicates what time it was. And he indicated that he made that call as soon as he got back to his room. So the call was made at 9:37. So he left the defendant's presence at 9:36. And you can see here, at 9:36, the defendant was last seen standing in the driveway. From 9:36 until 10:54, the defendant's whereabouts were unaccounted for. So we have the beginning of our window of opportunity at 9:36. Okay, now I'd like to remind you of some testimony you heard about the Bronco. Back up for just a minute. Talk about the car. Cato said the defendant almost always parked the Bronco on Ashford. And when I asked him when, during the 6 months that he lived there, he could remember ever seeing it parked on Rockingham, he said that he couldn't come up with any answer. I did ask him if he'd seen the Bronco either when they left the house to go to McDonald's or came back, and he indicated that he didn't notice either way. He wasn't looking for the Bronco. But there was a witness who was out on Rockingham that night. He was out walking his dog between 9:30 and 9:45. That witness was Charles Cale. He was a neighbor of the defendants. And when he was walking his dog, he was a neighbor of the defendants, he knew where the defendant lived. And I think he indicated that he had even been on Mr. Simpson's property at some point. So he was walking his dog that night between 9:30 and 9:45. And as he did so, he walked down Rockingham. And he looked, and he could see, I think he indicated it was 60 yards away, but he could see, that'd be 180 feet, that there was no Bronco parked on Rockingham when he was walking his dog, approximately between 9:30 and 9:45. Now there are two inferences we can draw from this. Either one is reasonable. Either the Bronco was on Ashford, which is why he didn't see it on Rockingham, or Mr. Simpson had already left in the Bronco by the time he walked his dog. Now, Mr. Cale also indicated that when he left his home on June the 13th at 7 a.m., when he drove down Rockingham, he did see the Bronco. And he noticed it was parked at kind of a funny angle to the curb. Now, what that tells us then, we have two reasonable inferences, and I'm going to talk to you about this a little bit later. We have a jury instruction on direct and circumstantial evidence. And that jury instruction tells you that when you have two inferences, both of which are equally reasonable, one of which points to guilt, one of which points to innocence, you are to adopt the interpretation that points to innocence. That is, if both of them are equally reasonable. Now, in this case, at the point that Charles Cale is walking down Rockingham and is walking his dog and sees no Bronco on Rockingham, since he didn't look down Ashford, it is equally reasonable that the Bronco could have been on Ashford as it is that the defendant had already left in the Bronco. The inference that points to the defendant that's less inculpatory, that is less incriminating, is that the Bronco was on Ashford. Let's take that one. Okay? So let's infer from his testimony that when Mr. Cale was walking his dog, the Bronco was on Ashford. What does that tell you? It wound up on Rockingham. That's where it was found in the early morning hours of June the 13th. No one's disputing that. The Bronco was moved. And the inference to be drawn from that is that the defendant was out in the Bronco and he moved it. But you don't have to rely on just that inference. We have more. And what we have two things. As you may recall, Dr. Baden was the defense witness pathologist. He testified that the defendant told him that he had gotten cut when he went on the night of June the 12th, as he was preparing to get into the limo, he went to get the cell phone from the Bronco. That tells you the cell phone was in the Bronco. I'm going to talk about how he got that cut a little later. The cell phone was in the Bronco. That's where he had to go and get it from when he was getting ready to get into the limo. If the cell phone was in the Bronco, and he's using the cell phone that night, he was out in the Bronco. And we have the proof for you in the form of the defendant's phone bill. Here's the exhibit that we marked during the trial. You will have this one back there with you. It indicates that the defendant made 2 phone calls on the night of June the 12th from his cell phone that we now know was in his Bronco at 10:03. Now, in terms of the timeline on that night, what this tells you is that the defendant was out in his car at 10:03. Now, at that time, he made phone calls to Paula Barbieri. You may recall we heard the testimony of I think it was Llewellyn Robertson of AirTouch, and she told you, she interpreted the record for you and what it meant. And she told you that the calls were not completed, but we didn't need her to tell you that. The calls to Paula Barbieri were not answered because Paula Barbieri was in Las Vegas. She was not at home, either in Florida or in Los Angeles. She was in Las Vegas at the Mirage. You recall we had a witness testify to that. She checked into the Mirage at 2 p.m. on June the 12th. So she was not available to take those calls. Now, I think we have further corroboration for the fact that the cell phone was in the Bronco in the fact that Alan Park, the limousine driver, testified that he saw, as they were loading up the limo, he saw the defendant go out towards Rockingham, out to where we know the Bronco was parked, once or maybe even twice. So there is further corroboration for the fact that he went and got the cell phone out of the Bronco just before they left. Now those phone calls are very significant in terms of their timing, because you realize that at 10:03, when he's out in the Bronco and he's made those calls, that the murders occurred about 10 to 15 minutes after that. So we'll talk more about the state of mind that he was in at that time. We'll do a little later. Now Cato, let's go back to Cato. He indicated that at about 10:15 or 10:20, and he's very approximate on these times. He's not looking at his clock. I think he readily admitted that to you. He made a phone call to his friend Rachel Ferrara, and that was a local call, so unfortunately we don't have a phone record to establish exactly when it occurred. This is an estimate on his part. Now, he testified, and I'm sure you recall it, that during that phone call, and he thought it was about half an hour after he made the call, he heard those thumping noises on his wall, very loud. So loud and so strong that the wall he was leaning on shook and a picture moved. And he said it was right in the area of the air conditioner that hangs over that narrow, dark south pathway. Those noises got him so upset. He suspected that it was an earthquake. He also told you he had suspicions that it might have been a prowler. And so he decided that he would go and see what might have caused them. And he told Rachel, he was scared and worried enough that he told Rachel that if she didn't hear from him in the next 10 to 15 minutes, to call the police. Now, he may have said it half-jokingly, but it's pretty clear he was worried. He was shook up. He was very shook up by those sounds that he heard, which is why he kept coming back to the issue, and he kept trying to talk to the defendant about it. And Alan Park, the limo driver. Now let's talk about Alan Park for a minute. You remember, he was the young man who had never been to Brentwood before. So he decided to make sure that he wouldn't be late. And although he was not supposed to be there until 10:45 for this pickup to LAX, he left at 9:45 to be on the safe side. And you may remember that this was a witness who was absolutely neutral. Absolutely neutral. He was not going to strain to avoid answers. He was not going to make any effort to embellish anything. This was a witness who was just going to tell it straight and tell it honest all the way through, no matter who was asking the questions, myself or the defense. And he stood up there and he took the grilling for a very long time. I went back and I counted. The cross-examination and re-cross-examination by Mr. Cochran took up 175 pages of transcript in these proceedings. Now, he told you that on that night, he was driving down Sunset. He made a right at Rockingham and drove up Rockingham at 10:22. Now, he looked at his clock and his watch many times that night. And the reason he did is very obvious. He's a driver. It's important that he be on time. It's important to him. It's important to his job. And this was an important job. I mean, he's going to drive for Mr. Simpson. You know, it's not just me, somebody like that, or somebody that ordinary average folk. It's important. He wants to do well. And he certainly doesn't want to be late, make Mr. Simpson miss his flight. So he's checking that clock. And at 10:22, he drives up Rockingham. And he's looking at the curbs to see the addresses, because he's never been there before. And he wants to see 360 Rockingham. This is also logical. I mean, what do you do when you're looking for an address? You look at the curbs and you try to see where it is. And that's what he did. But when he did that, he saw no Bronco parked on Rockingham. And he was looking right there at the curb. Do we have the picture? This is People 62A, Your Honor. Kind of looks faded on the... Oh, you can see it, right? See that curb area? You can see there's a 360 there. Now, as he was driving up, he said, I could see the 360 on the curb. Now, if he could see the 360 on the curb, and you can see where the Bronco is right there, that big white car, he's not going to miss it. He's going to see it. If he's driving slowly enough to see the number on the curb and realize that he's hit the defendant's address, then he's obviously paying enough attention to see a big old white car there, and he didn't see it. So we know that at 10:22, the Bronco was not on Rockingham. But we know more, because we know at this point, when Alan Park turned the corner onto Ashford, he told you he did not see any Bronco on Ashford either. So as of 10:22, that Bronco's gone, and the defendant is gone. That's further corroboration for what we told you with the phone calls in the Bronco. He was out in that Bronco on that night. So he indicated that he turned right onto Ashford, he made a U-turn, and he parked across the street from the defendant's home from the Ashford gate side. He got out of his car. Remember, he went and sat on the curb behind the car and had a cigarette, waiting for it to be time to start buzzing for the defendant. And when he got back in his car, he looked at the clock, and he saw that it was 10:39. Now, at 10:39, he decided to check out the other gate, the Rockingham gate, and see if that would be easier to pull into than the Ashford gate. Because remember, he told you he had that stretch limo, kind of hard to maneuver. So, what gate he went in and where he was, this was an important consideration for him. The logistics were not that easy with that car. When he drove down to the Rockingham gate, he told you that he pulled the driver's side window parallel with the driveway so that he could look into the driveway and see whether it would be easier for him to get the stretch limo up that side of the driveway, because of the way it curved. And you guys remember, you were there, you saw it's a curving driveway. When he did that, the area where the Bronco was found on the curb just north of the Rockingham gate was well within his field of vision, but he didn't see it. Again, further corroboration. The Bronco was not there. Now, he backed up Rockingham, and he backed all the way up past Ashford and then made a left back onto Ashford. And at that point, he actually pulled up into the Ashford gate so that the headlights would be almost up against the Ashford gate, I think he indicated. And he told you that he saw a 300ZX, a black one, parked to his left on Ashford Street, just to the left or east of the gate. And Cato told you, that's right, that was my car. That was there. And you even see it in some of the photographs that we've shown you during the course of this trial. Now, when he pulled up facing the Ashford gate, Mr. Park told you that it was 10:40, and he looked at his clock. At that point, he turned off his headlights and left the parking lights on, and he got out to push the buzzer at the Ashford gate. He wanted to let the defendant know that he was there. He pushed the buzzer, he told you, a good 2 or 3 times, and he heard the buzzing and the ringing noise as he did that, but he got no answer. He was concerned because the pickup was supposed to be, he told you, for 10:45. Starting to get up there now, so he called his boss, and he wanted to ask him what he should do. And I have a board that shows Alan Park's cell phone record. And that was a very important cell phone record, because that helps us to fix a lot of events that were testified to that otherwise would have been very approximate. With the help of his cell phone record, we have much more definite times, much more precise. He made the call to his boss at 10:43. You can see, we show you when the call begins and when the call ends. Dale St. John was his boss. And he called his pager. After he placed that call, he told you that he got out to ring the intercom a few more times. So now he rang the intercom at 10:40, no answer. 10:43, no answer. And he said he rang it a few times on each occasion. No answer. He noticed that there were no lights on downstairs and that there was one light on upstairs. He got back in the car and he called his mother. And he got his boss's home phone number and called him again at 10:49. And you see that call. We have a lot more calls in here. But at 10:49, he called his boss again. And he left a message because he got no answer. Now, when he left that message at 10:49 for his boss, after he hung up, he got out and tried the buzzer again. Now, this is the third time he's tried to get someone to answer that buzzer at the gate. The third time that he rang 2 or 3 times. And this third time again, he got no answer. Now, he also testified throughout all these events, getting in and out of the car and buzzing. You guys can sit. I'll come back to it in a minute. I'm going to wear you out. Thank you. He told you also, if you recall, that during this time that he was out by the Ashford Gate, he was paying attention to who was there. He was trying to reach the defendant, but he was very focused on whether he could get somebody to answer the buzzer, on whether he could get Dale St. John to call him back. I mean, these were the things that were occupying his mind. And he was carefully concerned about this because he had to get to the airport. But he was not listening for traffic. He was not listening to hear if a Bronco pulled up, and it wouldn't have been, he told you, it would not have been significant to him if he had heard a car pull up or a car door slam. So what? He's thinking, I got to get somebody to the airport. He's not thinking what cars are driving by, who's here, who's not here. He just wants to get going. He's late, and he's worried about that. So, although it would have been nice if he could have told us that he heard the Bronco pull up on Rockingham when it did, he just wasn't paying attention to that. And so he can't give us any information on that. We know the Bronco did pull up. We know it did because it got there. We know it wasn't there as of 10:40, 10:39 when he drove down on Rockingham, and it was there later that night. All right, back to Park. Now, after he tried the buzzer at after calling his boss at 10:49, he got out. It was when he was actually buzzing at that point. Let me back up for a second. He called his boss at 10:49 at home. He got no answer. He went out to the gate and he rang the buzzer again 2 or 3 times and got no answer. While he was at the gate that third time, he heard his car phone ringing and he went back into the car. It was his boss calling him. That call came in. That last call came in at 10:52. And he indicated now, he told you about the fact that his boss called him, and he told his boss that no one had been home, and he'd been ringing for a while, and he was very concerned because he was running late. Now, at that time, I asked him, were you seated in your car when you were speaking to your boss? He said, yes. Where were you looking? I was looking through the gate right into the driveway. Well, what is the driveway lighting like? What is it like in there? Well, it's not really very well lit. The play area down in front, I'm going to pull out a diagram of Rockingham in a minute and show you exactly what I mean. It was dark, though. There were very little light. There was a light over the garage, but it gave very little illumination, and it did not light up the south pathway area at all. So he sat in his car talking to his boss, looking straight through the gate and at the driveway. Okay, this is just to get you oriented in case you forgot. It's been a while since we went out and did the walkthrough at Rockingham. So You see the area that says play yard there, and Park indicated that area was very dark. He indicated also, as he was seated in his car at the Ashford gate, that he could not see the Rockingham gate from where he was seated. He indicated to you, you see where that line is drawn at the garage? He saw nothing below that line. His field of view was limited to what was in front of that line. And that's because of the lighting that was at the driveway.